Should we sit and get
Yeah,
rolling?
may as well.
Okay. Hello, we're about to get started here. If you could please double check, make sure your cell phone is muted. Appreciate that, thank you. Coming on out tonight and joining us for an evening with NPR's National Justice Correspondent, Carrie Johnson. We will be taking questions from the in-studio audience. Jane Carlson will bring a mic around. So raise your hand if you have a question. We'll get to those a little bit later, and she'll bring the mic up so we can all hear you. And then the online audience, just use the comments section. Before we begin our conversation, how about a little bit of background on Carrie? She covers a wide variety of stories about justice issues, law enforcement, and legal affairs for NPR's flagship programs, Morning Edition and All Things Considered. She regularly appears on the NPR Politics podcast. Prior to coming to NPR in 2010, she worked at the Washington Post for 10 years, and earlier in her career, she wrote about courts for the weekly publication Legal Times. She's received numerous awards and accolades for her work. We could take the entire hour just running down that list. But I'll mention in 2021, the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers honored her with a rarely bestowed Champion of Justice Award for her journalism work. Congratulations on that. She's also been a finalist for reporting on financial journalism and for the Pulitzer Prize in breaking news for team coverage of the massacre at Fort Hood, Texas. And we were talking earlier today, actually you got involved in journalism, started in journalism because of an interest in sports.
I was very interested in sports, Rich, and I figured if they would pay me real money, cash money, once a week to go sit outside and watch games. And then, this is how long ago it was, write up stories on my typewriter and put them in the mailbox of the local weekly newspaper. That seemed like a pretty great job, right? Great job.
Were you an athlete or you just enjoyed watching the games?
I am the least athletic and coordinated person you are likely to meet in your life. But I like to observe.
Met me yet, so.
But I just enjoyed sports, and some of the best writers I read as a kid started out as sports writers, people like Jimmy Breslin and of course Red Smith and the sports writers on TV, which was very popular on television in those years. And I did in high school and college. I spent most of my summers writing sports and sometimes editing the local newspaper in suburban Chicago while the sports editor went on vacation. It was a happy time for sure.
And how did you move on from sports to covering other things?
Well, I also became interested in law, and when I was in graduate school, most of my friends were in law school. I would attend classes with them periodically and watch them become humiliated when they were called on in class by the professor. And I did not want to be humiliated, but I was very interested in legal affairs because it seemed to me in that era, and maybe even more true now, almost anything that mattered in our culture wound up in the courts somehow or other. So writing about the law was a window into writing about ourselves. And that has become more true in the last 10 years than it ever was before. I never wanted to practice law. I'm not interested in billing my time in 6-minute increments, as most big-time lawyers do now. But it's been a window into, and sometimes a seat into, some of the most important disputes that we have.
How steep is the learning curve if you don't have that law background?
Well, it can be very steep, but the good news is that some of the best legal affairs reporters in the country are not lawyers. They know how to ask questions that matter to all of you because they don't have that kind of training and they're not sort of in the culture, so they don't use as much jargon and everything is new to them and they can explain it clearly to a general interest audience. That said, you have to be kind of careful about the kinds of experts you quote and rely on. earlier in your career. And you, surprisingly, even for television and radio, the job is almost all reading. You have to spend hours and hours and hours reading very dense material. And then sometimes, you know this, Rich, you get 40 seconds. You get 40 seconds on the national newscast to explain something. And if you're lucky, you get 4 minutes on Morning Edition or All Things Considered. That's the hard part of the job, but it's also a joy of the job, too.
Yeah, so you can take this question just about any direction. You're the national justice correspondent. Anything interesting happening on the beat?
Well, this year alone, I've covered the still ongoing sedition trial against members of the Proud Boys over January 6th. I've covered the still ongoing trial of a hip-hop star from the 1990s who's been accused of failing to register as a foreign agent of China for taking a lot of money from a fugitive billionaire. I went to Ukraine with the Attorney General of the United States to attend a conference on war crimes in the war, Russia's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine, and got to see President Zelensky from far away. He's not as tall as you would think, and but very powerful looking in his stance, and a great communicator, obviously. And I get to be here, so it's pretty much the best job in the world.
You also got to report on the indictment of a former president last week.
I forgot that. I did. I buried the lead, yeah? I did. I was in DC, not in New York, and my job that day on our live coverage was to hold the air and explain as best as I could without being in the courtroom, as we had a couple of people in the courtroom. The judge would not allow reporting from inside the courtroom or any recording. So it was pretty much a black box until our people came out and told us what happened. But I was able to do reading in advance and kind of explain the nature of the charges as we best understood them and the way those court proceedings go. And I had to explain to our host and our audience that even though court proceedings are supposed to start at 2:15, they may not start until, say, 2:30 or 2:40, because that's just the way courts work, right? And we have to fill that kind of airtime while being accurate and responsible in our coverage. And you know, to be in the studio reporting live and have a television beam in a picture of the former president going through the door and the security official not holding the door for the former president, that was pretty much the story of that day. It was a remarkable thing to witness. It really was. And that story, of course, is just beginning. We have major briefs due in that case in August. It may or may not go to trial before the heat of the primary season next year. And the former president is under investigation in at least 3 other areas, including 2 in my backyard in the federal courthouse in Washington, where I go almost every day. And I see his lawyers and former Trump White House officials coming in to testify before the grand jury. Those proceedings are secret, but we're able to observe them in the hallways. Often they run away from us, but we're able to watch their comings and goings at least.
What about, give us a look inside. So you're trying to fill airtime, and you don't know how long you have to fill.
Right.
You come in with a stack of papers like that, or is this all off the top of your head?
Well, the thing about radio is it's not great if the audience hears you rustling. I mean, sometimes it's in a very dramatic moment, it's kind of nice, but really it's not, right? So you kind of have to know in your head bullet points of what you want to say and go with it, right? And one of the things that I thought was important to tell the audience was that New York, the state of New York has changed its bail laws. So anyone accused of any kind of nonviolent offense is not going to be incarcerated pending trial. And I think that was important to tell the audience right away. You know, and even if there are conviction on these accounting type charges, it's quite possible there'll be minimal, if any, jail time. And so those kinds of bottom line assessments you kind of need to know about before you go into the studio, because those are the questions, you know, my mom might ask me at night, or her neighbor might want to know. And those are the kinds of things I want to be able to tell our audience before we get the report from the people who were inside the room and could talk about the demeanor and what the judge said and did and how things went in there.
Have you gotten a chance to read the charges now?
I have. And in fact, we did toward the end of our couple of hours of live coverage, we actually got the charges, which were pretty bare bones. And then we got an important document called the Statement of Facts, where the DA, Alvin Bragg, laid out a little bit more of the story behind the charges and his allegations that these charges were part of an effort to keep information, allegedly keep information from voters in 2016.
So you're covering a historic moment. Do you think about that when you're doing it? Have you thought about it since? Is this something you'll think about 5 years from now?
Yes, Rich. What I think about in that moment is don't screw up. Okay, and if somebody else happens to make a misstatement, or if I happen to make a misstatement, correct it gently as soon as you can and repeatedly. Right? Everybody makes mistakes. But really, don't screw up. And the thing about NPR, and I have had in 13 years, I've had to cover a lot of awful things. I remember doing what felt like hours and hours of live coverage after little children were shot dead in Newtown, Connecticut, and that was really terrible. And so. You want to be careful. You want to have an appropriate sense of the moment. You want to convey important information as accurately as you can. And you want to keep it together emotionally, which can be hard to do in those situations. I've covered a lot of mass shootings over the years. That one was pretty awful. And I think, often the audience is shaken. And it's our job to remain as cool as we can in those moments.
Did the network give you some time off to recover from covering such a story?
I don't remember that at the time. I remember my colleagues who had children that age were particularly upset, and understandably so. And I felt, as someone without kids, that I needed to shoulder a little bit more of that coverage, and I was happy to do that in that period of time. But we've had so many more since that era, and that's one of the hard parts of the job.
Getting back to the indictment of the former president, what angle do you anticipate exploring next regarding the case?
There are real questions about the strength of that case, or rather, there could be some real legal infirmities. We don't know a lot about the underlying charge that the DA is trying to use to bump up those bookkeeping offenses into felonies. And he offered in his news conference that afternoon 3 theories. One of them is a possible tax violation, but he provided no paperwork or evidence to the public or to the defendant. And so there are lots of questions about that case. That case was not brought in the Trump administration by the federal Justice Department. It was not brought after the transition to the Biden administration. And there are questions about whether a DA can charge felonies based on federal election offenses. So there are questions about the underlying tax allegations, there are questions about the electoral elements of the case, and there are questions about the statute of limitations, because all this goes back to 2016. And I think the former president and his lawyers are going to be very aggressive on all of those counts. He's also signaled that he wants to potentially move the case out of Manhattan and into Staten Island, where there are a lot more Trump voters. So we'll see how the courts handle that. And the other thing, I must say this, it's at the top of my mind these days, the number of threats that the district attorney has faced and his prosecutors have faced since it seemed clear these charges were imminent, and the number of threats the judge has faced. These are very serious things and very unfortunate things. And I think as reporters, we need to be mindful of them and cover them responsibly, but to talk about that we've had violence. You know, I was in Washington on January 6th, although not at the Capitol. And that moment is large in my mind to this day.
Refresh our memories. What role did you play in the coverage on January 6th?
My goodness. So on January 6th, I had just updated our midday show Here and Now. I don't know if you listened to that. It's a really good midday show because President-elect Biden had announced he was going to nominate Merrick Garland to be his Attorney General, and they were doing a big rollout. So my mind was very much focused on Merrick Garland and his biography and updating the show. And as soon as I finished with that, it became clear to me that something was underway at the Capitol. And we immediately pivoted into the chaos of that moment. This was in the pandemic. Most people were not reporting live from NPR headquarters. I sat on the floor of my home, with the microphone on for a few hours and filled in as I could. But it was a very chaotic moment. It was not clear what might happen next. It was not clear whether security was going to be able to get into the building and the Congress was going to be able to finish its job, and happily that happened. But just a very shocking time.
Have you been in the courtroom for any of the people charged that day? Many of them?
Yeah, I covered last year the trial of the Oath Keepers leaders, Stuart Rhodes, the guy with the eye patch you may remember. And Stuart Rhodes and his deputy Kelly Meggs were convicted by a DC jury of seditious conspiracy. They're going to be sentenced later this month, I believe, or early next month. And I'm currently covering, when I'm not here, the trial of the Proud Boys leaders, who are also on trial for seditious conspiracy. That case has been deeply unpleasant to cover, in part because a strategy of the defense team is to delay and complicate matters to such an extent that the jury has now been working for twice as long as it was told it needed to be on the hook, and it's been very difficult for them. I feared at first that closing arguments might happen while I was here, but the delays continue, and it's not even clear that closings will happen next week. So I am hopeful that case will proceed. And I also covered recently the sentencing of one of the men who sprayed Officer Brian Sicknick, the Capitol Police officer who died in the days following January 6th. And that too was among the more moving days in my job. I watched his mother, his father, his two brothers, and his sister-in-law address the defendant. And that was a very, very difficult thing to witness.
I imagine you have many more such trials to cover.
Yes, the Justice Department has charged over 1,000 people in connection with January 6th. It's told the federal court in Washington to expect about 1,000 more. And then, of course, we have very active grand jury investigations of the people who organized and funded January 6th. And those have not resulted in charges against anyone in the former president's inner circle, but very active grand juries there, and another very active grand jury on the investigation of documents the FBI found in Mar-a-Lago last August as well, and possible obstruction. So there's more than enough work for me to do back in DC.
What do you find most challenging about covering justice?
Well, I guess every day is one of those old-timey cafeterias with the conveyor belt. And every day you have to choose what's most important to the audience. Out of maybe 15 things some days can happen. And so the challenge for me since around 2016 has been making time to do more impactful projects and series. That was easy in the somewhat boring middle and late Obama years. I was able to go across the country and to places like this and sit across the kitchen table from wonderful people and ask them about their lives. And that's been very difficult to do since 2016 because so much so much is happening in Washington in a breaking news kind of fire drill situation that it's hard to get away. But I'm hopeful now that what I hope is the worst of the pandemic is over, that I can get back to doing some of those stories. Because those are the stories that maybe a big newspaper or a television network is not going to cover. You know, NPR is one of the few places that would pay to send me across the country and you know, talk to people in prison for life about their lives and their dreams for themselves and what they would have done differently. And those voices, I think, are important for us to hear.
Well, and you mentioned how things have changed since 2016, and we had a president who would use social media to put a message out instead of calling a news conference, gathering everyone. And so if he put something out on social media, that changes your day, doesn't it?
Oh, Rich. So one of my coping mechanisms in that era was 1 hour a week. I'm going to go to the gym. 1 hour a week. And I picked, I can't remember if it was a Tuesday or a Wednesday morning, before 8 a.m. Eastern time. So it was like 7 to 8 a.m. And I was in the gym, which I don't really enjoy, but is important for our health. And I was doing whatever thing the guy was making me do in the gym. And all my phones, I had multiple phones, started going off. The former president had announced on Twitter he was appointing Christopher Wray the FBI director between the 7 and 8 a.m. hour, which was not the person he told everybody else he was going to appoint. So we had stories kind of ready if he appointed the person he told people he was going to appoint, that he called an audible early in the morning, and I had to put down the barbell and run out of the gym and run home and go on Morning Edition. And I just thought, it's 1 hour a week. Can I not have 1 hour? And I could not have 1 hour. No, I could not.
Weren't you glad to get away from the dumbbells, though?
Well, you know, things have taken an even worse turn. So now there's no gym time at all. It's better to exercise just a little bit even. Yeah.
I asked you what's most challenging. What do you enjoy most about the job?
I love talking to people. People will tell you so many interesting things and unexpected things about their lives. And you just have to listen. And I get paid to do that. It's absolutely unbelievable. I will never forget, several years ago, I did a series on clemency. And I met a guy who was sentenced to life in prison. And I spent some time with his family. And after our series aired, he got clemency from President Obama. So months later, we went back and met he and his family and did a story on him. And, you know, what's your day like? So the guy puts me in the car. I don't really drive well. And he, you know, he's driving, and he's driving so slow. And I said, are you gonna, and he's like the most careful man because he knows he won the lottery. He got a second chance at life. He doesn't even want to go like 1 mile over the speed limit. And he's saying, don't put on the radio, don't distract me, wear your seatbelt, don't fool around with your phone. And I just thought, this is a man who was going to die in prison, who was worried about going 1 mile over the speed limit. And it was the most amazing thing to be able to spend some time with he and his family. And I just love people. And so, for all the terrible stories I have to cover, and they're mostly terrible, moments like that are really lovely.
A reminder, we will take questions from the audience. Does anyone want to chime in right now?
What about Clarence Thomas?
Can we get a microphone on you here? Just a moment.
What about Clarence Thomas?
Well, can you narrow down your question? That's a lot, yeah. Will there be any accountability? Is that your question?
Yes, I guess so.
Okay. Well, this is really a big problem. I mean, the accountability is a big problem because the justices don't think they have to follow an ethics code. They have kind of an honor system. Some of them have said if Congress imposed such a system on them, they might find it unconstitutional because it's one branch meddling with another branch. Other people in Congress have suggested restricting the court's discretionary appropriations. It's money. They haven't taken such a step yet. I will note that in the last few years, most public opinion polls have reflected that public confidence has plunged with respect to the court, and the court hasn't responded as a body. So there has been reporting by some friends of mine at the Post that at one point an ethics code for the justices was under consideration, and it never happened because they couldn't get all 9 of them to agree. So if they didn't agree then, will they agree now? I mean, I'm not allowed into their closed-door deliberations, but some of them, all of them are smart people. They must understand the kind of conversation that is happening outside that building. And it's just not clear to me how they're going to respond to it. I think the Senate Judiciary Committee is having a hearing on some of these issues in the weeks to come. There have been calls for John Roberts to conduct some kind of investigation. You know, the court just investigated in quotations, the leak of the Dobbs decision and came up with no real answers. And then it came out that their investigation involved conversations with the justices. Not interviews with the justices, there were conversations with the justices. So as somebody who made her bones in the newspaper business covering corporate malfeasance and internal investigations of companies like Enron and WorldCom and Tyco, and I spent 7 years going around the country covering crooked business executives. I know what an internal investigation that's real looks like and what one doesn't look like. And when someone is interviewing their bosses and having a conversation, that doesn't sound like the kind of investigation the SEC or the Justice Department might bless. So it's a pickle.
Just a moment. Yeah, over here.
Ms. Johnson, I used to teach at the University of Iowa in sociology. Okay, so one of the things I'm real conscious of when you are a justice reporter, right, is that much of the nation really has minimal understanding of justice.
Yes.
And I'm wondering from your perspective, because we have a nation now, 2017, we passed 90% of us have a high school degree, but 56% of us can't read and comprehend above a 6th grade level. So the concept of justice is one of those like magical concepts like love, gods, so on, right? Who has a definition that all of us share? No one. What's it like to report in an environment in which the word is almost meaningless?
Well, I would challenge your premise.
Go ahead.
I think if you ask a child in elementary school what's fair, they would have a sense of that.
I would agree.
Okay,
Yeah.
so you know that I've covered how many attorneys general, 6, 7, or something like that, and they all say this old talking point. Ours is the only department in which a value is, in the name of our department. Whatever. What's fair? Okay, right? And the system we have is deeply unfair. Okay, it's always been deeply unfair. It's set up to be unfair, and so I can spend all my time covering trials of January 6 people and investigations of the former president, but the most important work I've done is showing how the system hurts people who have no power, little education, and is deeply unfair to them. Okay, and so I've been happy over the years to shine a light on that. Sometimes people in power listen and people get out of prison where policies change because of the work I do. That's justice, right? Are enough reporters doing that? No. Do I spend enough time doing that? No. But every day I have a cyclone of news. And so I'm trying to make time for that work. It's harder now than it was 10 years ago. But smart people who are in the system know it doesn't work. People who work in prisons know that they're unhealthy places. People who have been involved in capital punishment themselves have mental health crises from their experience there. And I think those are important stories to tell. They're starting to be told. NPR is one of the few places that tells them. PBS does too. We need to do better at that. But it's only by banging away every day or every month or every 3 months or whenever I have time at the unfairnesses that are built into the system that I think we become better.
But don't you also encounter then justice? Don't you also encounter justice as a concept that means this for this group and that for that group? So when we are actually talking about justice, the meaningless I was referring to is we're not talking about the same concept when we're out here arguing in our communities and their divisions and so forth. And that must be amazing to watch from a national perspective and try to talk about a country that's claiming X, Y, or Z and has no shared language around it.
Well, you know, a lot about the law is about process, okay? You go to law school to learn process. And the process is supposed to be about one set of rules for everyone, okay? We can be cynical about it and say that not everybody can afford a lawyer, not everybody gets a good public defender. But every time you hear the Attorney General say, we want to uphold the rule of law and there's one system for everyone and no one is above the law, that's what the system is about, right? And so having a jury of 12 people decide the fate of people accused of seditious conspiracy, that's pretty amazing. We do that. A lot of other countries don't have that. And so for all its flaws and failings, for all the frustration I have for spending 55 workdays watching subpar arguments in the Proud Boys trial and wasting my time and wasting the time of that jury, we can all, anybody, any old buddy can go into the courthouse and sit in and watch that happen. And that's good. That's what we want.
You mentioned the amount of stories you have. That's an issue in this country is there's fewer reporters.
Yes.
And in some places we have news deserts, losing newspapers when corporations buy them and gut them. Do you see that much on your beat or
Yes.
in
Yeah.
DC?
I am a recovering newspaper reporter, okay? I have been writing for newspapers since I was 13 years old. I never thought I would do anything else. And I left. I left in 2010 because the industry was in trouble. And it's taken longer than we expected, but it's really, really in trouble now, which is why public media is so important. Something like thousands of daily newspapers have gone out of business. In the course of the Proud Boys trial, which started in December, 4 or 5 different news organizations, including my own, who are covering that trial have laid people off. Since that trial began in December. It's a real crisis, and it's a crisis that's really hurting people because you don't get news about your community, which is why our stations are so important. Which is why the work that you do here is so important, covering elections and municipal meetings and court cases.
Carrie, can I
Make
ask?
sure you save that for the next fund drive.
Yeah.
We know why you moved from newspaper to radio. What was that like for you as a journalist? How did it change your work?
It was the most traumatic experience I've had as a person, period. It was as hard as it gets. To go from having a sense of mastery over something that I had had from the age of 13-ish to 37 and be an absolute disaster. It was terrible. It was absolutely terrible. And I thank every single person at NPR who helped me figure out how to do anything. To the extent that earlier this year, I was invited to go on a very complicated international trip with no production help. So I had to figure out what I could carry for a couple of days, and then I had to test everything out and make sure I had all the batteries, and then think about if this piece of equipment didn't work and that piece of equipment didn't work and those batteries ran out, what would be plan D? If A, B, and C failed, what would be plan D? And to do this on a couple of hours of sleep over 3 days. And you know what? We managed to get like 3 stories out of my trip to Ukraine, which thank God for the refugee who gave me a candy bar also, because I was hungry and I really don't work well when I'm hungry. So like going from not being able to do anything for a period of months, or maybe the first year even, I was a total disaster, to 13 years later being able to like kind of function internationally on my own. It was a great relief. And I still do much better when I have smarter people working with me. But the other thing that I don't do, and this is a very apt question, is in the years when I worked at the Post, a part of covering Washington is covering interagency rivalries. The Homeland Security Department is annoyed with the Justice Department. The FBI is annoyed with the ATF. And so those stories are built on anonymous sourcing. You know what's terrible on the radio? Me saying something that I heard without anybody else's voice on the radio. So immediately, within like a year, I no longer did anonymous source stories very often, and I also didn't do incremental stories because people like you are super busy. You don't really care if somebody filed something or somebody said something might happen. Like, you want to know when something is happening of importance in your life. And so all of those bread and butter Washington stories that are like newspaper inside baseball things, I want to cover interactions between police and the communities they're supposed to serve. You got to get right in there. You can't like call somebody on the phone. You got to be there and like stick a microphone in someone's face. And sometimes they're not very happy with you about that. And you have to know how to manage yourself in that situation. And so those are much better stories. And I'm glad I made the transition, but it was more than I expected, for sure.
Yeah, hi. That kind of this question dovetails into what you're just saying. I was wondering if you'd be willing to speak about your process a little bit in terms of if you have a difficult source or after all the reporting is done, you're finally sitting down to write the story. You might not know how to write. Are there any specific approaches you picked up through your long career that you use frequently or that you found effective?
Right, so one of the things about a radio story is it really doesn't work well if you already know what you're going to say and you start writing before you have all your tape. We call the interviews tape, right? So some people use these transcription processes. I need to listen. I need to listen to all of the tape because people convey so much, not just through their words, but how they sound and the emotion and the pauses. And so until I listen to all of the tape, I don't know what the story is going to be sometimes, right? And the shape of the story, the backbone of the story totally changes based on the tape you want to use. And sometimes you may think you're doing a story about something and then the tape takes you in another direction. But that's the better story, right? And if you still want to do something else, write a story for the website and just type it out. But the radio story is the voice and what somebody's telling you and the pause. I'll never forget, years ago I was interviewing the Attorney General about all the subpoenas he had sent out to media organizations, and I said, well, like, how many of these do you think you signed? And he said, I don't know. And I rarely use my questions. In that case, I used the question, and I told the producers not that 7 seconds of was the story, right? And so anybody who's hearing that in their car, they know that's the story. Don't clip that, that's the whole story. So that's a way that the sound directs what we do.
And it used to be in the industry, you would cut stuff like that out, I think. And
Yes.
over time, we've kind of figured out you should leave. Sometimes you need to have a pause or some silence in there because it conveys a lot.
Yeah, and there's a famous example. Scott Simon, our wonderful Saturday host, some years ago interviewed Bill Cosby and his wife on the occasion of their donation to a museum, a charitable donation, and that was supposed to be the interview. And Scott asked Cosby about a number of allegations of abuse, sexual abuse, and Cosby just refused to answer the question. But Scott aired his question and then aired the silence, which really read as contempt, honestly. And people are smart enough to hear that. They heard that. Yeah, remember that? Yeah.
Jane, someone had their hand up over here.
I'm not afraid to admit my ignorance in terms of the justice system.
Let's see.
But can you explain how one judge in Texas can make a decision that affects half this country?
Well, you know, that's actually a subject of real ongoing debate, bipartisan debate. This idea of national injunctions, that one judge can try to create policy for the whole country. And in this particular situation over mifepristone, we now have two judges directly at odds with each other, right? And so this judge in Texas has sought to limit access, and this judge in Washington has issued a completely opposing ruling. The Washington judge's ruling applies to, I think, 16 states and DC, which is not a state, but should be. There's my advocacy. I pay a lot of taxes, and I have no representation. And so the Justice Department, what are we supposed to do here, right? So Merrick Garland has asked the Washington state judge for clarification. This afternoon, the Washington state judge said, no, I meant it when I said this drug should be available in these 16 states and DC. And it's now made it was likely already the High Court would take the matter, but now there's actually like a game of chicken on the highway with people's lives, and the court must act on it. Over the years, Congress has had different hearings on this issue of a single judge's power to issue national injunctions. The problem is that sometimes it's in your favor, depending on where you are on the political spectrum, and sometimes it's not. And so it's hard for Congress to figure out what to do or decide to do anything, given the fact that sometimes one party benefits and other times another does. But it doesn't seem to make sense. I understand your question, yeah.
You mentioned a couple times going to Ukraine.
Yeah.
Did you get much advance notice?
No, and we weren't able to tell anybody really, for security reasons. So I've done a lot of reporting domestically. I've done very little internationally, and so I was a little nervous, about that. But everything worked out fine in the end. And as always, I depend on the great kindness of people. So I crossed the border from Poland to Ukraine on my own. And I was standing in the very long line to go through passport control and then onto the train. And a young woman came up to me in English and said, this is the train to Ukraine. And I've never been so grateful in my life. This woman was basically saying, you're going into a war zone, you moron. Do you understand what you're doing? You look like you don't belong here, and I'm trying to save your life, basically. So, and I was like, thank you so much. I very much appreciate that. Can I buy you like a pastry? I do know what I'm doing, and I do want to do this, but thanks for looking out for me, And I can't tell you how many times in my reporting life I've been saved by people who are like, this is not really a safe place for you to be. Go stand over there instead. And I was very grateful for it. And everything worked out fine. Once I got into Ukraine, the presidents of Poland and Latvia and all kinds of EU justice ministers and all sorts of other important people were there. So the building was very heavily guarded and was fine. It was just, you never really know what's going to happen when you cross that border.
Were there challenging conditions when you were trying to file a report?
Yes, it was very hard to file without Wi-Fi, and at one point I needed to get something on All Things Considered, and the line kept dropping. So we did a pre-tape, and I had about 6 minutes to get the pre-tape done, and I had to do it from the back of a moving vehicle. And later someone said, "Were you like moving or something?" And I was like, "You have no idea what I was doing, and I'm not going to tell you because I'm not allowed." But it was a challenging situation. Although, you know, I've had colleagues who've had truly challenging filing situations. And in fact, at NPR, we did lose a couple of people in Afghanistan several years ago. And I know people who have died reporting in Ukraine personally. So, you know, this job means so much to me, as I know it does to you. And the idea that someone would lose their lives trying to inform people, it's just heartbreaking.
Was there any point where you felt in jeopardy
No,
there?
no. Only hungry. Only hungry, yeah.
What did you learn from being over there that maybe you didn't know before you were actually on the ground in Ukraine?
You know, on the train, once I was very aware of everything around me, and I looked back, and there were, you know, a large number of women and teenage girls and older people, and some of them had their little dogs and bags and cats, and there were no men, because all the men are fighting for their lives and for the lives of their families and the lives of their country. And to see that with your eyes just was very moving.
Never seen anything like that in the
No.
U.S.
No.
What else do we have? Do we have a question out here?
Yeah, we seem to be awash in misinformation and disinformation these days, and it concerns me greatly because people choose, you know, the media, they're going to be telling them the truth. How do you, as a reporter, deal with that to make it right so that people will listen and know the difference? How do you deal with it?
It's very challenging, right? We spent a lot of time in 2015 and 2016 doing fact checks. We would do live fact checks for every debate. Those are hard to do in real time. And I'm not sure that we convinced anybody who wasn't already listening to NPR. I don't think we did, actually. And so we've rethought some of that. How do you fight a culture that's awash in misinformation? I think you just keep doing your jobs. And I think you go to places where people may not agree with you, and you listen, but you keep doing your job. And it's unsatisfying. It's an unsatisfying answer, right? There have been some terrific journalism efforts to do journalism literacy and education in schools, starting at very young ages. I think those are terrific. I also think it's really important to just go at it every day, right? But I'm not sure that that is a long-term solution to this problem. I think the solution rests not with journalism, but with other parts of the culture, I must say. And you know, we do what we can, but as Rich said, we're a small and struggling breed right now. I mean, the number of times, and occasionally I post about this on social media, where the PR professionals, I hear from like 20 PR professionals a day. I mean,
Yeah.
everybody has left journalism and gone to work for PR. Like,
And they're
stop
terrible
pitching me.
pitches.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a very deep problem, and I think it's one that that we all need to work to resolve.
Carrie, you touched on the importance of federal judges, one in particular in Texas. The appointment of new judges, or the nomination, is being kind of delayed. Is the administration behind on appointing new judges?
Biden has actually appointed a record number of judges, but many of those came in states with 2 Democratic senators. And the holdup presently is in states where there's at least one Democrat and one Republican senator, or two Republican senators. And so the president was the head of the Senate Judiciary Committee for many years. He's very wedded to tradition in the Senate and to judicial appointments as they've always been done. Advocates, progressive advocates, are pushing the White House and the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Durbin from Illinois, to abandon a policy they call the blue slip policy. This is kind of an old-timey process where the White House would put forward a judge and the senators would return in the old days what was called a blue slip, thus allowing the nomination to proceed without a hitch. And some Republican senators will not return the papers, which puts the process at a halt. And people on the left, including people like Russ Feingold, who used to be a senator from Wisconsin and is now running the American Constitutional Society, now say it is time to abandon this old-timey process and just move forward. The counter argument is that every time Democrats have removed barriers on judicial nominations, when the power changes hands, the Republicans then enjoy that power. And so it's a real argument, but there are delays now. There's been at least one logjam, I think, in Mississippi, and there are others underway. And we're now, of course, in 2023, and the time is short. So it's a real subject of debate in DC. Yeah.
There's been some delays on the Judiciary Committee too because of Dianne Feinstein's health, correct?
Absolutely, and I think last night she urged Senator Schumer, the majority leader, to temporarily name another senator to sit on the Judiciary Committee. You know, you do, when you go into Congress, you do notice how many members are in their 70s and 80s, which was not the case when I moved to DC in 1996. There were some, of course, very old members. Strom Thurmond, for instance, Jesse Helms, and many others. But it is something that is noteworthy now about going to the Hill.
Do you feel like the court system, the judicial system, has become more political in recent years, or has it always been a political branch?
I think politics have always played some role. My friend Josh Gerstein at Politico, who's brilliant, recently made some remarks, and I endorse these, that because Congress has failed to legislate on many of the most difficult problems we face as a country, those problems then wind up in the courts, which then are inherently perceived as more political.
We have a question up here.
Coming back to the Dianne Feinstein issue, are you expecting, because my understanding is that whoever is appointed or whatever to the Senate Judiciary Committee needs Senate approval, correct? Are you expecting a tough fight on that?
I am not sure. I would have expected a tougher fight if some of the members of the committee were running for president. People like Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz, for instance, they are not running for president, but they may still decide to dig in their heels. And, you know, all it takes is one senator to say no. Just takes one. And we've had examples of that in the recent past, so yeah.
The former president filed a suit against Michael Cohen. How might that interact with witness tampering, witness intimidation, or the SLAPP laws?
Oh, those are good questions. So I think in the statement of facts in the DA Bragg's case, there is reference to unnamed attorneys who we know to be Robert Costello and Rudy Giuliani, leaning on Michael Cohen not to cooperate. So if you want, Trump has not been charged with witness tampering. That is not a charge against him. But in the statement of facts, there are pieces of evidence that could support that allegation. This lawsuit, I think, is less alarming and more about PR than about witness tampering. And then, of course, the former president also, during the Robert Mueller investigation, which I covered within an inch of my life and turned out to not result in really anything, there were lots of examples of alleged tampering with witnesses, including Michael Cohen, but also many other people as well. So we'll see. We'll see if Bragg adds charges. We'll see if Georgia decides to take action. We'll see if the Justice Department decides to take action. We're at the beginning of that story. It feels like we're in the long middle of the story, but we are only at the beginning of that story.
I have another one.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on Elon Musk, Twitter, and the NPR situation?
Oh boy. So NPR has announced it will abandon its Twitter accounts as a company because NPR CEO John Lansing has said he has no faith in the Twitter leadership because Twitter has tried to undermine NPR's credibility and because NPR is independent no matter what Elon Musk says. But the company, at this moment, the company NPR, says individual reporters, editors, and producers can decide on their own what to do with their individual accounts, which seems like the right balance to me. I do tweet pretty regularly. I'm going to keep up with my account, but I found the platform much less valuable as a reporting tool than it was for the last 10 or 12 years. And I may decide to let it go eventually. I'm not there yet. I do think it's an important moment, and after NPR made this decision, of course, PBS said it would also temporarily suspend its institutional accounts, but may decide to go back at some point. It was nice to see NPR leading the way, in a principled way.
Thank you.
How much do you get to choose the stories you want to work on, and how much is it editors assigning you stories?
I don't often get assigned stories anymore. The choice is one between stories I really want to do and stories I must do. So earlier this year, I did a story about programs that allow people in federal prison to apply for early release. They're called compassionate release. They were designed for people who are basically terminally ill and will otherwise die in prison. And I interviewed people who represent women incarcerated in Dublin, California, where, and this is terrible to say, I'm sorry to bring it up, there was a culture of rape in that institution, and the warden, the chaplain, and many other prison officials have been charged criminally with assaulting the women in their care. Some have been convicted and sentenced. And the argument that those women and their representatives were making was that we should be able to apply for compassionate release because it is extraordinary and compelling that we not be in here anymore with the people who abused us or the people who looked the other way while those guys were abusing us. And I did a very tough story on that, and I heard a lot of feedback about it. And then last week, the Sentencing Commission, this federal body that decides those questions, voted 4-3 to allow those women and other women and men like them in prison to be able to apply for compassionate release. The problem is, I was so busy covering the arraignment of the former president and the Proud Boys and the trial of the hip-hop artist that I have not yet been able to do a story saying the Sentencing Commission actually did this. However, maybe next week, if it's quiet, I can get to that. So those are the kinds of things I really want to do because, Rich, nobody speaks for those women.
Right. And you recently did a story on public defenders, too.
Yes.
That seems like a passion project for you.
I have been interested in public defenders since I started covering courts for a weekly paper when there were weekly papers. That's how long ago this was. And I learned that the best way to report was hang out at the courthouse and then at night to go to the bar where people would tell stories about their day in court. And so my favorite people, the people who taught me how the system worked, were those public defenders. And in that era, the DC court system was stiffing them. They were doing all this work for like some miserly amount of money an hour. And then the court system said it ran out of money and couldn't pay these people. Yeah. So they like couldn't pay their rent on their office or their home. And I thought, this is the most terrible thing I've ever heard in my life. And so I became very interested in that then. And now, 27 years later, when I can, I try to spend some time with those folks. Because they're the only way our system ever remains fair. It's not fair for them either. You know, in some places they want to go on strike. But if a public defender unit goes on strike, then there's nobody to represent the interests of the accused. And that is bad for all of us. So those are the kinds of things I want to do more of. Maybe when this phase passes, but I think we're going to be in this phase a while longer.
We have another question up here.
Carrie, you create sort of an interesting environment for us to listen to in terms of like, from a national perspective, you see all of these information, and you have to sort, right? You have to sort. And you've mentioned the loss of public and access of news locally and the destruction of it. This information becomes a major part of what we also encounter at a local level. And I'm curious, as a justice reporter, what do you feel is, in a sense, the most underreported problems of justice? And how do we at a local level increase its capacity to be told as a story?
You know, there's something very interesting in Maryland where during the pandemic, a lot of court proceedings went online. And so in the courts that I cover, you could dial into a public access line and actually hear court proceedings without physically being there. And there is a push to continue that now that we seem to be coming out of the pandemic, because the process of regular people, any old person, listening to a court hearing and listening to somebody get railroaded is important, right? And so in Maryland, there's a fight now about whether to close off access to some of those programs. And it's received a little attention because a singer who was popular in my era, Fiona Apple, has become a court watcher. And she's taken this up as a cause. And so she's kind of lobbying in her own way to maintain this access for the public. But it's very important. Any of these January 6th proceedings, you should be able to listen to from wherever you are. They're important for our democracy, in part because there are so many people saying the system is not fair. There are no rules. There actually are rules. There is a process. And to the extent that people are able to monitor that, to the extent they can and are interested, it counters all that misinformation about how people are being they're not being railroaded in these cases. They do have lawyers. They're getting due process. That's really important, that kind of public access.
I have another one.
Yeah.
So in our newsroom of 2 people for
Yes.
20 counties.
Bless you, yes.
No matter
yes.
how much time we spend on something, how in-depth it is, if it's a story about crime, it's going to have more impact in terms of, clicks, reaches, shares. Do you find that's the case with your work, that if there is a salacious aspect, then it has greater reach?
I almost never do anything salacious. I really don't. I just don't. But there are stories that get more clicks. And then there are other stories that I will tell my editor, I know the audience numbers on this are going to be low, but we need to do this story. And so I had one of those last year. It turned out that people signing plea agreements were being asked to sign away certain of their rights long into the future. And that seemed to me to be very wrong. And I was very upset about it as a human being. And I was like, bleh. And so I don't think the shows really wanted a radio story about that. And I said, I don't care, I'm doing this digital story. And my editor said, I don't think it's gonna get, and I said, I don't care, I'm doing the story. I'll do it on Saturday. I don't really care, I'm doing the damn story. So I did the story, and the Attorney General read it, and also thought it was wrong, and actually changed the Justice Department policy. So now, every time my boss said, I go, I told you so. So you can't do that all the time, but every once in a while, yeah.
And maybe if you get an interview with Fiona Apple, there'd be a lot of clicks on that.
I would like to do that, Rich. I'm going to suggest that. Yeah.
When Helen Thomas was here talking about the difficulty in getting access to important people or getting them to be honest with her, I wonder if you run into some of those same problems. Do you find it easy to get access to the people who are going to be important to your story? Do you have to bribe them in some subtle ways to try to?
Well, there's no bribing. There may be extra charisma applied. That doesn't usually work either, honestly. In the old days, if I really wanted somebody at the Justice Department, I would wait until the security detail fired up the SUV, and then I would stand by the door and pounce upon the person, and ruin my mic. But that doesn't work so more because the security guys don't like it when I attempt to pounce upon government officials, so they try to sneak around me. Okay, so what the last several years have taught us at NPR is that some people should not be interviewed live on the radio. Why is that? Because they are not truthful people. And when they are interviewed live, they can filibuster and refuse attempts to interject with fact checks, and they can spread mistruths, which is not what we do. And so there are whole bunches of people we should not interview live on the radio, and we should interview beforehand. And then if fact checks or alternate information needs to be introduced, we will do that before we play the story for you. And that is a good way to proceed, and I wish that other news outlets did that, because some people are truly impossible to interrupt when they are spreading misinformation and saying things that they know are false. And we should not give them your time. It's your time, right? It's not my time. It's your time as listeners. We don't do that anymore. In stories that involve election denial, for instance, you will hear that now. That you'll listen for that, because you're not going to hear that the same way as an audience.
We might have an idea of who some of those people might be. Can you share any stories about who we should be following, or who are some of the bright spots in the government and justice that we ought to be paying attention to?
Sure. One of the smartest people I know is not on a day-to-day basis, working on the ground, but a woman named Sherilyn Ifill, who led the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She's one of the only people 2017-ish, became very upset about the legal profession's inability to police itself, because many of the purveyors of this misinformation are trained lawyers, and they should know better, and there should be consequences for what they have said and done. And so Sherilyn Ifill, years ago, wrote a very important op-ed in the New York Times on that subject, and she was one of the only people who had the strength and moral authority to do it, because she wasn't beholden to some law firm or other, because she's a civil rights lawyer and didn't have those kinds of pressures on her. And she always bends towards justice. I'm a huge fan of hers. She's a very towering moral figure for me. There are people like that in like the civil rights community and some other communities that may not have big government jobs, but they're the ones who speak truth to power, and we need to get them on the radio more often. We really do. And young people who don't have financial incentives.
We have a question up here.
This question's a little out of left field, and it goes back to your earlier work in sports.
Yeah.
So I'm a theologian, but I'm also a Blackhawks fan.
Fantastic.
And
yeah.
so, as is Rich. And I've noticed that I'm really intrigued by the sports broadcasters and the kind of, I don't know how conscious they are of the ethics they use in their broadcasting, but I'm intrigued by how, you know, there's this raw honesty when they're interviewing an athlete, right, in the middle of a game. But they both acknowledge and frame conflict, and they always have these ways of drawing you back to caring about the game and the sportsmanship more than the win or the loss.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if you've ever thought about that sort of thing and how it might relate not just to journalism, but to the things you said journalism can't itself do, like leadership around polarization, around disinformation. Yeah, so it might be a hard question.
Well, I spoke last year with a group of judges. I was one of 3 or 4 reporters who met with a bunch of federal judges. And I made a plea for more access because at a time when there's so much lying and so many questions about our institutions, I think giving people a look inside the institution as much as possible, more information is better, right? More good information. And so I made a plea for them to, you know, issue their rulings in a timely way and not do it over the weekend. And maybe it doesn't have to be 250 pages. Maybe you can just write 50 pages, you know. And maybe you can let us into your courtrooms, and maybe you can set up a media room so that some reporters can type on their laptops and transmit information while a case is ongoing. I do remember tremendous interest in the Trump years when I was covering, say, court proceedings involving Paul Manafort, the former chairman of Trump's campaign. And, you know, like, people wanted access to that information. And judges can control how much we're able to share and when. So it's more of a process answer. As for, it also, that is the legal equivalent of sportsmanship. Due process is, right? Like, this is the way the system works. It's messy, it takes too long, it can be boring. People are sometimes jerky with each other. But in the end, people come to a decision. People are punished or not punished. And generally we accept those rulings and we move on, and nobody engages in violence, let's hope, right? And that's the sportsmanship. That's the rule of law. That's the equivalent. I do kind of like conflict, right? I mean, I've always liked conflict. The law is about conflict channeled in directions that are supposed to be productive. We don't really like it, although you do like hockey and the people come to blows, right? Okay, all right, well then the point lands. Then the point still lands.
Are there any well, we have another question over here.
I would like to hear, if you're willing, your own personal reaction as an individual in your profession to what has taken place recently in the Tennessee House.
Well, I have been introduced to 2 or maybe 3 extraordinary new public speakers and leaders. And being that they are in their late 20s, I expect to be hearing a lot more from them. And the idea that they were expelled and then within 7 days, within 4 days, were returned, what has happened? What is the outcome of that? We have 2 new national leaders, right? And the people spoke, which is the way the system is supposed to work. And nobody got hurt. That's the system working, maybe. But I very much enjoyed hearing from both of them.
Is there a final thought you would like the audience to leave with today?
Thank you for listening.
NPR's Carrie Johnson, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, it's my pleasure.
I do have a final comment because Jane asked my question earlier, but I just commend you for your careful, even-handed reporting, and keep doing it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
And thanks to everyone who came out tonight and everyone who joined us online. Have a good evening.